Hi, Lucy. Welcome to this little project of mine, which is a project about being in conversation with IOPT practitioners. As we become more global, we have contact through things like Facebook and emails and things like that. But I'm rather interested in the more personal aspect of who we are as practitioners. So there's two things that I'm interested in with you. One is just that, is the personal aspect of how you came across IOPT work and what your personal interests are. And the other one is the fact that I also know that being a parent, you're also very interested in working with parents. So I'll start off by just asking you a more general question about how you came across IOPT work. What was the moment at which you thought, yes, I think I'm going to pursue this a little bit more?
Okay, sure. So I actually came across family constellations initially, I think in 2008. So my son would have been about 1.5 at the time. And I was already doing some counseling for myself and encountering quite a lot of difficulties with just being a parent and what that meant for me. So I was looking for something, and a friend of mine suggested family constellations. I got interested, I came along. And through that work, I then encountered Franz's model of the split psyche. So somebody showed me, they had a book of his, must have been an early book, of the 3 parts of the psyche: the healthy self, the survival self, the traumatized self. And at the time, I remember having an absolutely kind of double experience of, on the one hand, with my brain not at all understanding it really, but with my body feeling, I'm interested in this. This is something that means something to me. And I really remember that feeling of, I can't explain the reasons why, but it feels like it's important. So I then looked up Franz Rupert, who is this person, and actually then wanted to meet him, because my idea was, I want to know who this person is, and is he a safe person I can trust and work with. So, and I found there was, I think there was a seminar, this must have been 2012, but it was fully booked. But he was doing a lecture and there were still seats available. So I went along to the lecture, and I remember I was thinking about this the other day. The subject was burnout, stress, or trauma.
Yes.
Do you remember?
I do, yes, I do.
Organised by you, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was.
And I went along, and I remember him talking about the symptoms of what people call burnout, and the fact that it could be due to having a stressful job or a stressful environment, but actually the question is, underlying that, is there trauma? And I remember putting up my hand at the talk and asking a question at the end and saying, the symptoms you describe are all things that I know in myself, and actually all I'm doing right now is being a parent and mothering my child. So can that apply to me? Is it possible that then there is trauma there, and that's why the activity of being a mother is causing all of these symptoms in me? That was my understanding at the time. And he said, yes, of course.
Of course.
So then I think, yeah. So then, of course, I then wanted more contact. I wanted to speak to him. So I think after the lecture, I went and I queued. And I realized what I was doing was, in a way, testing for myself. Is this person safe? Is this somebody that I can rely on? Do they want something from me? Is there an agenda, or is it literally just information and potentially a really helpful way of working? And that was my experience, that Franz was very open and very present, and I didn't feel like there was an entanglement there. It felt clean. So then I thought, okay, now I'm interested. And I think that's when I came to probably your workshop for the first time, and I think also came for an individual session with you as well. So that was my journey, really. As I say, a kind of body response to, I guess, the theory, but without, it took my brain a long time to catch up with, what is this? What does it mean intellectually? Because it was my body that was responding to, there's something here which makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way of doing it. And so what then happened next? And how has it all sort of impacted your life then?
I don't think I ever looked back. I think I came to the first workshop, I remember, with you in when you were living in Ealing. You had a room there, and there were probably about 10 people fitted in the room, and we were there for 2 days. And I remember really specifically feeling almost sort of squeezed in a way between two realities: the reality of what my life as a child had really been like, and the reality of what I may have then unconsciously passed on. At the time, I only had, wait, I'm just seeing if this is true. No, I had both my children by then. So I had 2 children, one aged about 5, one aged 1. So the reality of what I was potentially passing on to them. In other words, ways in which I had potentially been traumatized as a child, and ways in which I was also potentially traumatizing my own children. And somehow, and this was right at the beginning, and again, it took me a long time to really understand what that meant, but I felt that feeling almost like being in a vice, if you like, the pressure between two things. And I remember thinking, I'm not sure I can handle this, but at the same time feeling there's something here which is worth it if I can stay with it. So I didn't really look back. I started the work and I just continued, one-to-one workshops, learning opportunities. And I realized I was interested kind of with all of me. So I wanted something for myself, and I still do. That's still a big part of why I'm working with IOPT, because I still want things for myself. But I was also interested in learning in a wider sense. And I think that's how we came then, probably my friend Maria and myself came to you then to say, would you run a training in the UK, organize it, and so on, and it kind of unfolds.
And of course, this is the case, is that you joined my training then, and this has been years now that you have been very devoted to the work. And you bring something up there that I think is very common for IOPT practitioners in workshops, is when people first come into contact with the work, particularly if they are parents, the first, rather, for many, horrifying thought that many people have is, what have I done to my children, when they start to realize. And of course, this can be very distressing for people. So you've just said a little bit about it, but I see it as very common. And I think the interesting thing, what you've just said about the tension between seeing that there's something for me, and also this rather horrifying idea that I've actually done the same to my children, is very challenging for people. So perhaps can you say a little bit more about how that was for you?
Sure. Horrendous on one level, really, really tough, actually. But what I've come to understand is that even the act of realizing, oh, I'm traumatized, and therefore I have traumatized my children, even that is actually a gift for my children. Because what it means is we're not then unconsciously all, and in a way my partner included, of course, he has his own background, has his own trauma, he has his own story, and we are, the 4 of us, a family system, if you like. Yes. So when the awareness comes into that family system of, oh, there's trauma, look, we're actually traumatizing each other because of our own histories, then something else is possible.
Yeah.
I would say now, from where I am, it's kind of the key, actually. It's very painful to acknowledge. And I find particularly with parents who are older, who come to this work later in life and their children are perhaps adult. I think that's another grief, which I'm fortunate not to have experienced. My children were little, as I said earlier, they were little when I discovered this work. So in a way, I've had the luxury of the opportunity to change things while they're still in my care.
Yes.
And they then have the opportunity to develop themselves. And what my experience is that children take absolutely the first opportunity. As soon as there's more space for them to be who they are, they're there. Whereas I think we as adults have had however many decades of living more in our survival structures, it's harder to let go and, you know, adapt and in a way become healthy. Whereas actually children are right there, you know, they're waiting in a way for their parents to catch up.
Are there any, I think that's very interesting what you're saying about just in the realization that creates space. It's like if the topic is there and the topic can be acknowledged, certainly with both parents, then in some ways there's space for the children. And I wondered whether there was any particular examples you would be willing to give from your own personal experience with your children that you would feel okay to tell.
I think it's in everything. It's really in everything. So I can say something general, for example. So I have a son who is now going to turn 13 soon, and my daughter is 8, although she counts from conception her age. So she's actually 9 1/4.
So she's already educated a little bit in our system, in our thinking.
We had a conversation when she was quite a bit smaller about the fact that actually your age goes from when you first exist. And she was very excited about that and wanted that as her age. So now if people ask how old she is, she'll say she's 9.
Yes.
True, of course.
Yes.
I don't know why we count from birth. Well, I do in a way, because we are avoiding the first 9 months because it's too vulnerable. This is my idea.
Yeah.
You know, we discount that time. It's convenient.
Yes.
So I can say, for example, that one thing I have noticed in our family dynamic in general is that as my partner also works with IOPT, he's not a practitioner, but he works for himself, and he's been working, as you know, for the same amount of time as me, the last coming on for 8 years. And what I see is that as he becomes himself more and I become myself more, we're not so entangled with each other. And for my son, I see that that's very important, because what I observe is if the tendency in our relationship was that I would call the shots and everybody would have to fall in line. Now, if that's my survival self being controlling and saying what we all have to do, or, you know, just kind of coloring the family dynamic, then that's really unhealthy for the children. Whereas if I am in that mode because something is causing me stress or whatever, or I'm closer to my difficult feelings and I become controlling, if my partner stands separately from me and doesn't need to agree, then my son has a completely different role model.
Yeah.
And then he can learn that he can also say no.
Yeah.
So when I'm being unreasonable, he can also say no to it, and he can decline the invitation to become involved in that dynamic. But without that, I think as a growing boy, a boy who is, you know, potentially on his way maturing into a man, a young man, it's very hard, I think, without the other parent being able to be separate.
Yes, to stand on their own. Yes, and give something different, provide something different.
Exactly. And also the safety, you know, you can't say no to your mother if there's nobody backing you up. Because while you're dependent on your mother, it's too dangerous.
Yes. Yes.
That's an example I give.
So you are now in practice. You are practicing as an IOPT practitioner. Can you just say a little bit about how your practice is at the moment and how you are, what your central interests are in that?
I have to say that more and more my interest is in working with parents. I mean, in a way, you know, we are all the children of parents. So it's always valuable and fascinating for me to work with anyone, actually. But specifically, what I find most rewarding is if people come and they say, you know, my son or my daughter is in a very difficult position. This, and this is happening for them. And then I am able to hold a space for the parent, mother or father, to be working with themselves. And then the feedback that I get, you know, fairly consistently is, now my child is better able to communicate with me. Now we feel clearer. Now the symptoms are relaxing. So this gives me a real sense of satisfaction. And I think it's because, you know, that's what I would have wanted as a child.
Yes.
And my symptoms were loud. as a teenager, I mean, when you're little, symptoms can go under the radar, but when you're older, they can become quite pronounced, quite obvious.
Yes.
I would have wanted someone to deal with themselves in order that I didn't have to carry everything that I was carrying.
So, yes, of course. And I think it's very tempting, and often happens, I know from my own experience as a psychotherapist over the past 30 odd years, it's very tempting for parents to see what goes wrong with their children as the problem, rather than seeing how I think of it, the children as a symptom of the problem between the parents. And so I'm wondering, I know that for myself that if somebody comes to me and asks me if I'll work with their child, I have never really felt particularly interested in working with children. I'm much more interested in working with the parents, and I will always say to the parents, I'll work with you. How do you manage that yourself?
In general, I say the same. It depends on the age of the child for me, and it also depends on the child's want. So if there is an older child, maybe a teenager, who really is saying, I want this for me,
yes,
then that's different.
That's different. I agree. Yes.
I also think if ideally both the parents, but certainly one parent is committed to working with themselves, then maybe there's a place for working again with an older child. Mm-hmm. Because I certainly wouldn't work with a child in isolation. So if somebody came to me and said, my child has this and this symptoms or these and these problems, and as you say, it's like outsourcing, as if the child were the problem. And I think society-wide, that's what happens.
Yeah.
Is that children are pathologized when all they're doing is being a flag or a marker for what's not right.
Yes.
In the system. So that I would say, I would say the same in a way as what you have just said, which is I will work with you and then let's see. And, parents have asked me, can my child do this too? And I generally say, let's see. It doesn't tend to ever be necessary. Yeah. Especially if the children are small, because actually the environment around them starts to change and the contact that's possible between the child and the parent starts to change. And then, of course, the child doesn't need to behave in a certain way or have a certain illness anymore.
Yeah. So I know that, as you said before, that you have a particular interest now in working with parents. And I remember for myself, the first time I did a parenting workshop, and there was a couple who came on the workshop who sat there and said, we're going to have a baby and we want to make sure that we're in good shape before we even get pregnant. And I remember I was so moved by that, so touched. And so was everybody in the workshop as well, to have them take that pre-thinking. Now, one of the things that you were talking to me about the other day, which I got really interested in, was something you call conscious conception. And I think you said something about, why do we decide to have children? Why do we have children, and why do we decide not to? And so, of course, I decided not to have children, and I know in the beginning that was probably a survival, it was a survival strategy. But I have to say, I'm now at my age, and I don't regret not having children. But I want to hear something from you about this conscious conception thinking that you have.
Well, this is my kind of vision of a brave new world, is that as everybody takes it really seriously. What does it mean actually to bring a child into the world? What does it really mean? And also, if I could, sometimes I think, I wouldn't rewind my life, because I love it as it is, with all of the things that have happened in it that have been so difficult and challenging. But it's like, if I started now to think, if I started now, I'm 43, it's not impossible to have another child, I wouldn't do it now. Not because I think it's not good to have a baby, but because, I already have 2 children and I know that they need my attention, and there's still things in me which need unlocking and releasing. It would be unnecessary to try. It would be a distraction for me, actually, to have another baby now. So that's one thing. And I think, if we can know ourselves as well as we can before we have a baby, then that baby has a so much better environment in which to grow. You know, and perhaps we do already have one child and thinking about having another, or even while pregnant. You know, it's perfectly possible to do this work whilst you're pregnant, or you know, the father can also do it while the mother is pregnant. And I think for me, it's really key to understand, why did my parents have me? And this is a general question for everyone. Why did my parents have me? Did they mean to?
Yes.
Were they happy when I appeared? Did I become an impediment to, you know, their life plans? Was I the wrong gender? Were they expecting a boy, or, you know, if it was a boy, expecting a girl? Am I expected to be something for them? Yeah. For example, if there's a business, a family business, or even something to inherit, a title, I don't know, am I supposed to be next in line for something? Or can I just be me? Or am I, you know, have I been conceived because actually my mother really wants my father to stay with her, and she thinks that maybe if she's pregnant, he will stay? All sorts of things. You know, have I been conceived because my mother lost a baby, and actually she wants to try and replace that child? And even that is actually a common thing, I think, that is still said now. You know, if somebody miscarries, oh, well, you know, you can get pregnant again, as if that's the solution to the trauma of losing a child.
Yes.
Is to replace that child with another child. So I think there are so many reasons. And then even deeper than that are, which I think would have been true in my case, certainly when I conceived my first child, is actually more about, I don't know who I am. I don't know who I am. I don't really know what my purpose is. And I can remember when I was pregnant for the first time, I felt like I had a purpose.
Yeah.
Now, that's not about my child.
No, that's a really interesting one. Yeah.
That's nothing to do with him as a person. That's about me and needing to feel that, you know, I'm pregnant now, therefore that's my purpose.
It's like a substitute identity.
Yes, exactly, in a way. And then, of course, there are the other underlying things like, you know, having not been mothered and seen for who I am, maybe I'm thinking this baby can mother me. I mean, I'm not thinking it consciously. But the energy of that is there, and you know, we see it in the work often enough, that a child is expected to be perhaps a substitute I for the mother, or an energy source for the mother, you know, a source of life energy, so the child is not free to be who they are.
In Franz's latest book, the Society book, Traumatized Society, he talks about the fact that as humans we have the choice. Partly because we can conceptualize the idea that we don't have children. We have this choice. We also have contraception, which makes things much easier for us to choose not to have children. But it is still so assumed, particularly as a woman, that you are going to have children. I mean, you know, I've lived a life of, I decided not to have children, probably, as I said, originally for the wrong reasons. But all my life, from time to time, people would say to me, oh, why did you not have children? As though I was odd. I always felt odd. And I always felt like I had to come up with a valid reason for choosing not to have children, because it was not the norm. And I don't feel that now. And I had a workshop once, which I thought was very interesting. It was another a parenting workshop, because I used to do them. And I decided in the workshop to turn the tables on the participants. It was some years ago now. And whereas I'd always been asked, why did you decide to have children? I decided to ask them, why did you decide to have children? So I had decided not to. And it was really interesting and quite shocking in a way, because every single reason that people said, I could see was not really about the child. It was about them and some of the things that you have said. And I've never asked it again, because I felt a little bit like, whoa, I have opened up something here that's quite strong. So I think this idea of conscious conception. The other thing I just wanted to pop into this is, as you know, I've just been editing Franz's latest book, Love, Lust and Trauma, which is about sexuality and the trauma of sexuality. And one of the things I found really interesting that he was writing about is how sexuality for humans is immensely pleasurable. And so the issue of having sex, because it's pleasurable and because it offers us in its healthy form an opportunity for loving contact with someone else, is completely separate from the issue of reproduction. So we are a species that can have sex just for sex's sake. And then the idea that we have this separate thing, which is about reproduction, for me ties in with what you're talking about conscious conception, of actually making a decision to have a child and do it in that sort of way. I don't know if that brings up any more thoughts from you about the issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complex one, because this whole idea of being wanted is an interesting thing as well. You know, there's obviously a conception that happens by rape, for example. You know, it's not the sexual act is not wanted.
Yes.
Therefore, the child, of course, is not wanted because the whole thing was not wanted.
Or it's troubling. It's troubling. It could be wanted for other reasons. Could be even wanted for revenge or something. But it's very confused already, of course.
Exactly. And I think what Franz is talking about, as you say in that book, is also about sexuality that becomes divorced from, that becomes a separate entity in itself, and it isn't embodied anymore. You know, so if we are looking at having a child, then I first of all need to know who I am. I need to have a good sense of my own sexuality in a healthy way. I need to be with a partner who has a similarly good sense of who they are and a good sense of their own sexuality. Then we make a conscious decision. Do you and I really want to bring a child into the world? Is it actually what we want? Or adopt a child, or foster a child? You know, there are many ways, of course, to start a family. And I think they're all, you know, the underlying question is the same. Do I really know who I am? And am I clear in my wants? And within those wants, is there really space for the child to be who they are? Because I think a lot of mothers, you know, that I would work with would say, yes, I absolutely did want children. But there's another level of honesty required about why.
Yes.
Really, why? And
Yes.
I think, you know, it's a tough one. Again, it's hard as the child of parents to look at, you know, did my parents want me? And if they did, why? What for? Was it about me, or was it about something else?
Right. Did they want me, or did they just want a child?
Exactly. But actually, so in other words, am I a subject or am I an object?
Yes, exactly.
But actually, I think, again, you know, from the point of view now of being a mother, you know, if you find that as a mother, actually, you know, I've got to be honest, I wanted a girl and what I had was a boy. It's a great relief for the child when we as mothers come to terms with these sorts of fundamental things. You know, there's actually no mileage in pretending that's not the case.
Yes.
Because energetically, that child knows it.
Yeah.
So it's much better to be with that. And then the question is, why? Why did I want a girl and not a boy?
Yes, I'm being conscious.
What's it about?
Yeah, and being conscious of it.
Exactly. And then even once the child is older, still exploring that, because then it can free up that burden in a way. You know, I've worked with a lot of men who, you know, for whatever reason, their masculinity has been a real threat to their mother.
Aha, yes, of course, yes.
And then how to be a boy?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I can say, you know, again, sort of as my son approaches puberty, going back to this issue of having a father who is clear enough that he doesn't need to save me over the child, you know, clear enough to stand with the child. And I think, you know, if a mother is traumatized and there are, for example, sexual perpetrators in her background who were male, then it's very confusing for that mother to have a male child and not on some level be afraid of him.
Yeah.
Although there's a kind of a double-edged sword to this, which I have found often, which I'm sure you are aware of too, which is about, on the one hand, this child should be my protector.
Yes. Oh, my savior.
Yes, this little boy must save me from the perpetrators, but also he reminds me of the perpetrators.
Yeah.
So you know, many pieces of work where, you know, the child is doing their best to be the least male possible.
Yeah.
No, it's absolutely a compromise of identity. It's a trauma of identity. If I can't be the sexuality that I am, the gender that I am, how can I be me?
Yes.
So then men growing up, not with the masculinity, not as an integral part of who they are. And again, I think this is something Franz writes about in his latest book as well, how that then becomes, the sexuality becomes divorced from the person and then can cause all sorts of issues.
Yeah.
That potentially then becomes a sexuality that may be predatory or could just be completely suppressed. And that person never really fulfills themselves sexually in a healthy and pleasurable, as you say, enjoyable way, because actually it's so banned.
Yes. One of the things I was writing yesterday about the trauma of sexuality myself, and thinking about things like shame and guilt, that sexuality is so much a part of being human. It's part, there's no animal out there that is ashamed of their sexuality. So these things come immediately from the outside, from the perception and assumptions of the parents that are put on the child from very early about their gender and their sexuality. Indeed.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a challenge. I can say for myself, my daughter, for example, she's very free in her body, and why not? There's absolutely no reason why she shouldn't be. If she wants to run around naked, great. But, there are issues there for me. There are trigger points in that for me about what does it mean to be free, to be in your own sexuality, embodied in your own gender, to be delighted with your femininity. All of these things, they push buttons for me. So then I need to be constantly looking at that for myself so that I don't start to inhibit her.
Indeed. Okay, so let me ask a different question now. You also work with, as you said earlier, I think, working with parents whose children are grown up and are adult. Say a little bit about how you think about working with those kinds of parents who may say, they may have an adult child who's a drug addict or something, who's already making a disaster of their lives, and this parent then starts to see their own responsibility in that and starts to think, well, what can I now do about that?
I think there are variations because, of course, one of the things that happens in traumatized families is sometimes connection is just cut. So something happens, and then let's say an older parent who's perhaps also a grandparent, their children have had their own children, and then communication is gone. So something's happened, there's been a row or an upset, and the adult child is no longer in contact with their parent. So in a way, then the job of that older person is working in isolation, is what can I do for me?
Yes.
What can I do for myself? And then as and when my adult child would like to be in contact, I can come into that contact in a more healthy way. So that's one version.
Yes.
And then I think another one is, perhaps someone who's actively involved in the lives of their children, and the children are adults, and perhaps even possibly too much involved. So there's an entanglement there where the child has not really been able to leave and be independent and autonomous in that way. And then there's a question around, okay, so how, working with that person working with themselves and asking, how much is my adult child's dependence on me? How much is it healthy? How much is it to do with actually what I want from them? So these sorts of dynamics, can be cleared either way. And what I think is interesting is my experience, and it's true for me too, is that people will often come for the sake of their children more than they will for the sake of themselves.
Absolutely, yes.
And I think, the great learning in that, and it's still something I'm still learning, I would say, for myself over and over, is actually when I really focus on myself and make myself the priority, my children benefit.
Yes.
And I would say that's true at any age.
And of course, that's so against our culture, really. Certainly in the West, I'm not so knowledgeable about elsewhere, but this it's so seen as being selfish, and that this idea that we should put everybody else before ourselves is so much of a cultural meme. I think one of the things that is very challenging for people when they first come into contact with this work is this idea that they could put themselves at the center of their life, that they could, take themselves seriously. And of course, one of the things that's also true is that for so many people, nobody took them seriously. And so people don't even know how to take themselves seriously and make themselves at the center of their life. It feels like a real transgression against everything that they've been taught.
I understand, and I think it comes right back to the issue of conscious conception that we were talking about before. Actually, if my parents know who they are and are clear that they want to create a space in which I can grow as my own unique individual self, then I am the priority.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's really healthy. And I think you're right. People have not experienced that. And actually, the survival strategy of the child is, I must look after everybody else.
Yeah.
Make sure mom's okay, make sure dad's okay, even make sure siblings are okay, or whoever is my caretaker, I must look after them. And actually it's it's kind of threatening and frightening to put yourself first. Well, as a child, it's not an option. Unless there's an environment that says, yes, you are important and you may prioritize yourself.
Yeah.
It's actually too life-threatening to do it. And then we carry that all through. Because
as an adult, we still have within us this child that's still looking for our mother's love. And so we are still trying to get that and take care of her and make her first in our life. These early traumas, I call them the identity traumas now myself, the trauma of identity and the trauma of love, and the trauma of sexuality, and how they follow on from each other. So I wanted to ask a little bit more about your current practice. How are you doing one-to-one work? Are you doing group work? What's your favored way of working, and how is it working out for you?
Well, my favorite way of working is being in the same room as the people I'm working with. So right now it's kind of frustrating. Having said that, I do work online and have done with people who live abroad, which is great.
Yeah.
And have done that for several years. I do prefer to be in the same room with the people I'm working with. There's no doubt about it that contact, the physical contact, and the kind of, it's important, the energetic presence of the person. So yes, I do work one-to-one. At the moment, I run monthly workshops for parents called Healthy Parents, Healthy Child. And that, I think, is becoming increasingly clear to me that that's where my interest really is, as I said before. So I'm not sure what I will do with that, whether I will create more groups, more options for people. I mean, one thing is, thinking about working with parents is, when are they free?
Yeah.
How much time have they got to come? For some people, it's such a big deal to even come away from their families for a day, to find somebody else to be with the children and to come to an appointment, is a big deal in itself. So so I work one-to-one, and I run groups, and I also have been teaching a little bit, kind of an introduction, as you know, an introduction to IOPT, which I also really enjoy. So I'm currently in a position where I'm really thinking about what else do I want to offer, and also the more that I work with parents and get to know what the needs are, what the wants are, then I can start also to create more opportunities that work for people.
So the workshops that you're doing, how do you call them?
Healthy Parents, Healthy Child.
Healthy Child. Are you doing those online?
I am.
You are, groups?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. That's wonderful. Because you will be then available to all sorts of people in different countries to do that. Are you finding working online works well?
I do. I find it's very effective, actually. I mean, it's not my preferred option to be sitting, at a screen as we are now. I would rather you and I sitting in a room. It would be nice. So I'm happy to do it. But for me, before we had a lockdown situation, it was more because that was the only way. So it started with, I was a little bit skeptical about working online, and then a person I'd been working with for quite a long time moved and wanted to continue work. So then I thought, well, it's either say no, sorry, or start working online. So it felt much better to keep the connection. And I've worked myself as a client a lot online, and I find it really useful. It can be very useful. So I think, the theory is so sound and the method is so good that I think it holds, in different environments. It really seems to hold. And the method of resonance seems to work. If you're over the other side of the world, it doesn't seem to be a problem.
I sometimes, you just said the theory is so sound, and for me it's so logical. This is what I love about it. One doesn't have to have faith or believe in something. What Franz has put together is just so bullet point logical. This appeals very much to my rational brain. I think the things that I've always found difficult are things where you have to have some sort of faith in things. So yes, I was going to ask you another question about your relationship to the theory. You've sort of partially answered that. What aspects of the theory particularly do you feel interested in? And perhaps also what aspects of the theory do you feel you haven't quite got the grasp of? If there are any, maybe you've got the grasp of all of it.
I'm not sure I've ever really properly understood what the psyche really is, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
It's like I'm happy to leave it as a concept because the truths that I'm working with feel real. So, and I know every time Franz writes a book, he writes a chapter about the psyche or a section. And even an interview I watched with him the other day, he spoke about, kind of precede the psyche. And I always find myself on some level going, and, so I'm not sure if someone said to me, can you define the psyche? Can you say what it is? I generally say, Franz writes about it a lot. You can read about it. I mean, it's not, maybe I'm being harsh on myself, but I think there's something, I'm not particularly scientific. And actually, I surprised myself by liking this method so much because it is quite scientific.
It is, yes.
I think the phenomenon of resonance I feel comfortable with because it's something that just, feels familiar to me. Like,
that is the bit, in a way, where one has to have trust and a bit of faith.
Exactly.
The theory is one thing, but it's the method that's a bit kind of, that people kind of think, oh, what's going on here? I mean, it becomes second nature to us. We understand it so well. But in scientific terms, it's the most sort of, or the least understood, as different from the theory. But you talk about the psyche. Actually, the psyche is one thing I feel I do understand, and it was very interesting for me because, I did 7 years training as a psychotherapist back in the 1980s, and nobody ever talked about what the psyche was. And it wasn't until I started reading Franz's books that I really did come to it. So I have, I think, a good understanding, and it is one of the things I'm going to lecture on in the lecture series that I'm doing, because I actually think it's extremely useful to understand how the structure and function of the psyche is, and what the senses are for and what the emotions are for, that they are not, because our culture tends to think about the emotions as being this sort of slightly wishy-washy thing that you don't take too much notice of, and that the intellect is so much more important. And that's just so not the case, so not true. So I'm not going to give you a lecture at this point about the psyche, but it is one of the bits of theory from Franz that I find actually really useful and exciting. What other bits of theory what are the bits of theory that you do feel particularly like and understand and make sense for you and you feel passionate about?
Well, I think, the Franz's model of the split psyche after trauma, just makes absolute sense to me. As I was saying earlier, this kind of initial encounter with the picture of it, not knowing what it meant, but somehow also, And actually the little opening bit that you have on there, I think the little gap.
The little gap. So
Yeah.
my colleague Vivine made this for me from the Netherlands, and yeah, I like the little gap too.
I love the gap. So I will often, when I'm talking about trauma, I will often when people are new or I'm explaining something about it, I will draw that model because it's so useful. And for me, I suppose in a way, the parts of the self almost become like characters, with voices of their own. So I was saying, I think even at a workshop at the weekend, it's like the survival self, when you get to know your survival self, actually sounds different. Has a different voice, has a different vocabulary almost.
Yes.
It's like, it's not, and I think that's the exciting part for me, is recognizing the different parts.
Yeah.
Really starting to know, and especially at the beginning of the journey for anyone, that's part of it. How much am I, what of this is really me? What if this is really who I am, and what if this is how I've had to survive?
Yes.
And starting to hear the younger parts, the voices of the younger parts, and recognize them in a process, see them, hear them. And so the whole idea of entanglement, I think, is so useful. Well, the phenomenon of entanglement, but the naming of it is so important.
Sure.
Starting to separate out what of this is actually mine and what of this belongs with my parents. And it's crucial as well then, as a parent, to take ownership of the things that are mine. And I see things, for example, in my daughter that I know come from my mother and perhaps her mother. So it's kind of multi-generational effect.
Yeah. So that makes me want to ask you a little bit about the practice, about the intention method, because we haven't really looked at that yet. So you're talking about entanglement. How do you see that appearing in the processes?
Well, what I find so useful now is the kind of latest development with, I know the method has been through permutations and refinements over the years.
Sure has.
What I really appreciate now is the introduction of either the mother or the father or possibly another family member or key person to, in a way, disidentify a part. So let's say the word want, for example, is showing up very strongly as more like the mother of the person who is doing the work rather than their own want. It's someone else's want. And then the ability then to bring in that person, the mother, the father, even maybe the grandparent, and to start to differentiate between the two. I remember when that was first introduced, and because I hadn't seen Franz working for a while, I didn't quite understand what was going on, and I wrote to him to ask him, and he just so clearly explained it to me. When a part is identified with another person, then we bring in that person to separate them out. And of course, I thought that's so logical. Then I, as the client, can see what is mine and what is actually an identification with somebody else. So that's, I would say, how the entanglement shows for me mainly is that parts of, I use myself as an example, parts of me are identified with another person.
And so the representation will flip, if you like, or show different things. Yes, I can see here that there would be a whole exciting conversation just about the method and about seeing these things in the method. But I think I have to leave that for another time. Just to stay on that for a moment, is the whole thing as Franz starts bringing in the parents, and then we start doing that. And then I get kind of keyed up on this issue of, why are we doing this? Because I think there's no point in just doing something just because you do it. You have to have a really good reason, and you've just given the right important reason for thinking about bringing in the parents or not. This feels like it's another conversation about the method and doing that. What I'd like to ask you now, just because we're coming to the end of this, is if there's anything else that, given this opportunity to have a conversation and to share your own thinking about things, is there anything that I haven't asked that you would like me to ask you?
I mean, I suppose there's probably something I would just like to say, which is that actually, for me, IOPT has been, I can say, the single most useful tool you know, other things have been supportive and feed into it and, you know, allow me to continue my journey. But actually, for me as a mother, nothing else has even come close to answering the question of why. Why is this so difficult? Why can't I do it? Why do we have all these problems? You know, nothing has come close, because it actually has, as I said earlier, a sound theory that explains why.
Why is my child doing this now?
Yeah.
Making it understandable and logical, and then you can do something about it. If you don't understand it, you can't really do anything about it.
That's right. And I can remember, you know, as a new mother, actually, you know, really feeling like I was falling apart and trying to communicate that to others. And actually, people didn't really want to know. They didn't really want to see. I'm talking about other parents now at this time.
Yeah.
Really want to be with the vulnerability of, this is impossible. Mothering feels impossible. But this gives me a why.
Yeah. And of course, there's a terrible thing of shame about not knowing that one is supposed to know. And yet, I think this is the other thing we get from IOPT, is this understanding that we're all, I haven't come across anybody who's not traumatized yet. So we're all traumatized. We're all, you know, making the same mistakes and having to learn the same things and do the same work together.
And it's not, you know, it's not conscious and it's not deliberate, actually. You know, if we have been damaged, if we have caused damage, it's a result of trauma.
And it's a result of learned survival.
Exactly.
Trying to survive.
What I love is that we then have a tool which, you know, no matter how bad something has got, there's a tool to do something positive and real and lasting about it.
Yeah. And use our will for good purpose. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. First of all, find, you know, what is it that I want? Where is my want?
Yeah.
And then, then use it to good purpose, to have a good life.
To have a good life. That's a perfect ending. Thank you so much, Lucy. It's been really a pleasure doing this, and I hope that people who watch this will find it helpful and useful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Vivian. Thanks for asking me.